Hilchos Tumas Meis, Perek Shleisha V'Esrim, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 23. Today is a very, very special day on the Chabad calendar. I don't know if we officially say Good Yom Tov or not, but the Rebbe definitely called it Yom HaBohir, a shining day. The 14th of Kislev, it's the Rebbe's own anniversary. 96 years ago, in 1928, he married Rebbetzin Chayamushka, the daughter of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And as the Rebbe himself expressed on his 25th anniversary, he said, "This is the day which connected me to you and you to me." He was talking to the Hasidim. I guess on a physical level, it simply means he married into the family. The sixth Chabad Rebbe was Rabbi Yossi Yitzchak. He only had daughters. And by the Rebbe marrying in, he connected to the Hasidim who were also the followers of his Rebbe. But obviously on a spiritual level, it means that the Rebbe became connected as a Rebbe. Because once the marriage happened, a potential for a seventh generation of the Chabad dynasty was created. And since a Rebbe doesn't become a Rebbe is born a Rebbe, and every personal event of a Rebbe is relevant to the entire generation, so this marriage was really a momentous occasion. It created the potential for Deir Ashvi, for the seventh generation as we know it, the Rebbe in his full leadership, all the teachings that he would transmit, really in a certain way all began on this day. So it's a very, very special day. And interestingly enough, there's a wonderful talk that the Rebbe delivered on this chapter today that ties in to the concept of marriage, it's a beautiful, beautiful talk, but I'm going to tell it at the end of the chapter once we see all the laws that we discussed today. So with that, let's get to the Rambam itself. We're talking about Tzamid Pasil. Tzamid Pasil is the law that states that even though typically if a corpse is in a room, the impurity spreads to the entire room, if there are utensils, either non-susceptible utensils or objects, or pottery utensils, if they're tightly sealed, things inside them, as a theme, are saved from impurity. That's the way we've been talking about it till now, for the last two chapters. We were talking more about general laws, what constitutes a vessel, what constitutes a covering. Today we're going to actually get into the power of Tzamid Pasil. What exactly is saved when it's inside a tightly sealed utensil? And as we're going to see, is going to be a difference between non-susceptible utensils and pottery utensils. The Rambam begins with non-susceptible utensils. Halacha Aleph. Kol hakelim hamatzilin b'tzamid pasil. All utensils that act as saviors when they have a tight covering wrapped around them. Matzilin al kol mashe b'soichan. They save everything inside them. Bein oichlin, bein mashkin, whether it's food or drink. Bein begadim uklei shetef, whether it's clothing or klei shetef, we're going to translate as immersible utensils. Utensils that if they become impure, they can be put into a mikveh and become pure. Metal is a good example. Glass is a good example. Zehu din Torah. This is biblical law. Avol medivrei seifrim. But the rabbis came and said, Shakli cheres hamukaf tzamid pasil, that true, non-susceptible utensils is a full green light. But if we're dealing with a pottery utensil that is surrounded by a tight covering, einoi matzil, ela al ha'oichlin, va'al hamashkin, va'al kli cheres acherim sheyu b'soichai. It only saves food, drink, and other pottery utensils that are inside it. Avolim hayu b'seich kli cheres hamukaf. But if inside the pottery utensil, which is surrounded by a tight covering, if inside there are klei shetef oibgadim, immersible utensils, or clothing, harei elu tmeim, then they become impure. That is the rabbinic point that becomes the focal point of the first halacha in this chapter. Biblically speaking, pottery utensils are like non-susceptible utensils. Everything inside them is saved. The rabbis came and said, immersible utensils inside a pottery utensil, inside a room with a corpse, are not saved. The question has to be asked, why did they say that? Why did they say that a pottery utensil is not like any other non-susceptible utensil which saves everything? Why shouldn't the pottery utensil save everything? And the Rambam is going to present quite a long-winded answer, which is going to require some prior knowledge that the Rambam is only going to introduce to us really later on in this book. And also, it's going to require it to follow a whole bunch of information. So I'm going to present it. I just didn't have an easier way to do this. I'm going to present it in successive points on the slideshow, and we'll take in all the information outside, and then we'll see how the Rambam presents it. It's going to be a little bit different. I'm putting it forward in a little bit more of an organized fashion as far as I can tell, just so it's easier to digest. Then we'll go into the Rambam and we'll see it all. So here's the prior knowledge. The prior knowledge is that there are a category of Jews that were called Amei Ha'aretz. Literally means the people of the land. It basically was a certain element of the Jewish people that the sages observed not to be so careful in the laws of ritual purity. And because ritual purity and impurity was so prevalent, it was such a part of everyday life in temple times, so if people were not careful with it, there really was a lot of questions that were raised around the status of their food and their homes and the utensils and all kinds of things. So the rabbis unfortunately had to institute a series of protective measures to stay away from different things belonging to Amei Haaretz. And one of those protective measures was that utensils of an Am Haaretz are considered impure. Without getting into the details, what did they touch, what did they not touch, we're just going to consider it by default. There's a utensil of an Am Haaretz, it's considered to be impure. With a lower level of impurity, as we've seen way in the beginning of this book, some impurities make you impure for 7 days, like corpse impurity, other impurities just for 1 day. It was the 1 day impurity which the sages imposed on it. By default, if you're walking into a Am Haaretz's home and you're dealing with any of his utensils, you have to assume it's impure. Therefore, here's what happened. In things that can become impure, there are what we call non-immersible objects and immersible objects. Non-immersible objects are things which once they become impure, that's it, they stay impure. There's no way to revert back to being pure. Food, drink, pottery utensils is a good example. Pottery can never become impure. It can never become pure. Once it's impure, that's it, it stays that way. And then you have immersible utensils, which are things that you can put into a mikveh and they become pure. So what began to happen was the following. If a chaver is the Hebrew term for a pious Jew, a Jew who was not an Am Haaretz, he was keeping the laws scrupulously. If a chaver would borrow a non-immersible item from an Am Haaretz, he would simply treat it as impure. You would just know nothing bad could happen from it, because there's no prohibition to consume things that are impure or to use things that are impure. But you just knew it was impure, that was it. If a chaver borrowed an immersible item from an Am Haaretz, he would immerse it, put it in the mikveh, and use it once the sun set. Okay? So far so good. It's simple enough. Am Haaretz's utensils are considered to be impure. Therefore, if what I'm borrowing is non-immersible, I just look at it as impure. If I'm borrowing something immersible, I immerse it and I wait a day. Now, here's the problem. The problem is when it comes to corpse impurity. As we've seen multiple times, impure utensils cannot act as a blocker from corpse tuma. Even though many times utensils can be blockers. Once something itself becomes impure, it cannot be a blocker. Which means, in relationship to corpse impurity, even if an Am Haaretz would seal his own utensils tightly, if they would end up being with a corpse, they wouldn't save what's inside them from becoming impure for 7 days. The corpse impurity would spread to them, and whatever is inside them, because they're essentially impure. Now here's the second worst problem. The second problem is that Amei Haaretz don't believe their utensils are impure. They advertise their utensils as pure. Understand? The sages impose this restriction. But the Am Haaretz believe that they're good. They don't believe that this impurity exists. So you understand? They're holding utensils that to a chaver are A, by default considered impure. B, if they came into contact with the corpse, anything inside them is also not going to be saved and also going to become impure. So watch what happens. If a chaver were to borrow from an Am Haaretz a non-immersible item, anyway he treated it as impure. So it wouldn't matter whether it had been with a corpse, because whether something's with a corpse or just regular level of impurity, it's impure. You treat it as such. But because of the corpse issue, if a chaver borrowed an immersible item, he might immerse it and use it after sunset, but it might have been with the corpse, which means that it has to become impure for 7 days. You following? Because the Am Haaretz utensils are impure and they don't block what's inside them, maybe he had inside his utensil in the corpse this other utensil, this metal pot, this glass jar, and because it was, the Am Haaretz thinks it was sealed nicely, it was in the tent of the, it was covered, it was tzamid puzzle, it's all good. But because the whole outside utensil was to begin with impure, it never saved anything inside it. And so it's going to come out that a chaver is going to borrow something immersible, thinking that it's just regularly impure, so he puts it in the mikveh only for 1 day, and really he's ending up using a utensil which is totally impure for 7 days. So the logical solution to that would be potential solution, just say all utensils of an Am Haaretz don't save anything in an oil when they're with a corpse. Just teach the Am Haaretz, hey, your utensils are just not blockers. The problem with that was that wouldn't help because Am Haaretz compared themselves to Chaverim. They would look at the Chaver, they'd say, look, I'm also a religious Jew. Whatever his utensils can do, my utensils can do. If his can save in the oil, then mine can save in the oil. Therefore, the sages came and said, no pottery utensil can save immersible utensils in an oil. Anything that's inside which the Chaver anyway wouldn't have a problem with, food, drink, pottery, those can continue to be saved. Additionally, if the utensil itself is non-susceptible to impurity, there's no reason to impose a decree because even if an Am Haaretz owned it, it wouldn't become impure. It's a full blocker. But if it's a pottery utensil, holding inside of it an immersible utensil, across the board they said, nobody's utensils can save these immersible things. This way, when Am Haaretz looks over at a chaver, what's he going to see? Oh, the chaver's pottery utensils also don't save the immersible stuff, so I'm fine if my utensils don't save immersible stuff. To me, it's an amazing concept of Avos Yisrael, how we decreed something on the chaver, just so that Am Haaretz can keep on looking at himself with pride and comparing himself to the chaver, and therefore the chaver also has to suffer. It's a very interesting thing to reflect on. But either way, that was the decree. So I know it's a little bit long-winded, let's just follow it again. The core issue is that Am Haaretz utensils are impure, and impure utensils cannot be a blocker. But if the Am Haaretz is under the wrong impression, thinking that his utensil is a blocker, so he's going to think that what's inside of it was saved if it was sealed tightly, give it to a chaver, and the chaver is going to end up using something which is impure for 7 days after 1 day. That's the bottom line of it, okay? Now the Rambam is going to go a little bit different in the order which he presents it. That's why I think it's good to say it out first, and now we can see it in the Rambam. So let's go to the Rambam itself. I repeat again that line. Why did they say that a pottery utensil cannot save everything like any other non-susceptible utensil? It says that it's because the other utensils in question are not even susceptible to impurity. They can't become impure. But pottery utensils could become impure. And once a utensil is impure, it's not a blocker from impurity. And since all utensils belonging to Am Haaretz are presumed to be impure, as we're going to explain, so it's going to cause a problem with an Am Haaretz's utensil. Now the Rambam first asks the question that I asked at the end. Why didn't the sages simply say, an Am Haaretz's pottery utensil won't save anything, and a chaver, a regular scrupulous Jew's utensils will save everything, because he's pure. It says that they couldn't say. Because an Am Haaretz in his own eyes is not impure. Because he says, if pottery utensils can save everything, me and the chaver are the same. Therefore the rabbis were stringent, were suspicious, and they decreed that the Am Haaretz's utensils, or that nobody's utensils, can save everything. Okay. So why then was it okay to say that that it could save food, drink, and pottery utensils? So he goes backwards. In other words, he says the decree was that Am Haaretz's utensils are problematic. We had to also make the chavers problematic so that they should be equal in each other's eyes. But why did they give a positive power to food, drink, and pottery utensils? Says the Rambam, because these three things, Tmein, Hin, Al, Gav, Am Haaretz, are impure because of being involved with an Am Haaretz, Bein Koydem Sheyu Ba'il Meis, Bein Achar Sheyu Sham Tachas Tamid Pasul. Whether before they enter into a corpse or after they enter, even if they're in a tight covering, they're always treated as impure. Ula Olam La Yishal HaChaver Me Am Haaretz. A chaver will never borrow from an Am Haaretz, not food, drink, or pottery utensils, unless he presumes that they're impure. Because there's no way to become pure. You can't immerse these things. So he'll never become to a stumbling block because of them. Whenever he borrows them from an Am Haaretz, he wouldn't care about the prior circumstances, they're always going to be impure. But immersible utensils, typically, what would a chaver do? He would borrow these things from an Am Haaretz, put them in the mikvah because of the contact they had with the Am Haaretz, wait till sunset, and use them in purity. But perhaps that utensil was inside an Am Haaretz's pottery utensil in a corpse room. Therefore, the sages were suspicious. Maybe the chaver is going to borrow from the Amaretz an immersible utensil that was under a tight covering in a pottery utensil belonging to an Amaretz, which the Amaretz believes. The Amaretz thinks that it was saved. When in reality, because it's impure utensils don't block, and the metal immersible utensil inside that pottery utensil is completely tummy for 7 days. Meanwhile, the chaver is going to borrow it, put it in the mikveh, let it go to sunset, use it with pure stuff, and come to a stumbling block. Therefore, they made a decree that a pottery utensil cannot save any immersible utensils inside of it, because that might lead to a stumbling block when the chaver borrows something from an Amaretz, as explained at length. So that covers the laws of food, drink, and pottery and immersible utensils. What about people? Halacha beis, adam shehaya nasun b'seicha chavis. What if a person got stuck in a jar? A person is in a barrel, umukefes samid pasul, and it's surrounded with a tight covering, and there's a corpse in a room. Tahar, says the Rambam, it's pure. The person is pure, meaning the utensil saves him. Obviously, it shouldn't be glass, it should be pottery, but the point is just to bring out the person in the jar. Even if this jar with the person inside of it was turned into a support for a grave, where many times when it comes to support for a grave, while the support itself is not impure, a person touching it becomes impure. So if this jar is a support for a grave, the person touching it should become impure. Nevertheless, says the Rambam, the sages didn't decree anything over here. People are saved in a pottery utensil with a tight covering. It seems to me, what's the reason for this? The reason that the sages didn't make a decree that a pottery utensil shouldn't save people, even though people also are immersible. So the same way you decree on immersible utensils, why don't you decree on a person? This scenario is very uncommon. Uncommon scenarios, the rabbis didn't impose decrees on uncommon scenarios. Halacha Gimel. Here's another exception to the rule. Pottery utensils that were used for the ashes of the red heifer. The next set of laws, Hilchos Para Aduma, we're going to see at length. Every utensil used in preparing the ashes for the Para Aduma was very, very holy, very, very treated with a lot of respect. And even Amei Ha'aretz knew that you don't touch those things. Oy bekadashim, or pottery utensils that were used to hold holy things that were consecrated to the Mizbeach, oil that was consecrated to the Menorah. Amei Ha'aretz ne'emanim al ta'arasam. Even the Amei Ha'aretz were believed about their purity status, because they're very careful. And therefore, if such a pottery utensil ends up with a tight covering in a corpse room, yatzilu al hakel b'tzamid pasul, they will save everything inside them with a tight covering, afal pi shehin shel cheres, even though they're pottery. And pottery stuff from Am Ha'aretz don't save all the immersible stuff. Here they will, because the whole decree is that the Am Ha'aretz's utensils will end up being impure. But this stuff, the Am Ha'aretz will never make it impure. It will always stay pure. And therefore, what's inside of it will also stay pure. Halacha Dalid says that Rambam, consider the following case. This is going to be a case where we don't actually have a utensil with a tight covering, but we have a scenario that looks similar to that, which by the way is going to open up the doorway to the next chapters, where we also deal with many similar cases of things within a room with a corpse that will be saved because it's similar mechanism to an idea of a tzamid pasul. And what is that? Aruba shebein bayis la'aliyah. You have a skylight between a first floor and a second floor. Back to the skylight, okay, but don't get too scared. It's not so complicated as chapter 16. You have a skylight between a first floor and a second floor. The Tuma babayis. And there is a source of impurity in the first floor. Here's the corpse. Ukdeira nisuna al piha aruba. Now there's a pottery pot on the skylight, filling up the skylight with its back to the first floor. Remember, pottery utensils only become impure from their inside. So the bottom, not the opening, is facing the first floor. Unekuva b'koines mashke. And it has a hole big enough to allow liquid to seep in. Like we had yesterday, that's a hole that is big enough to consider a utensil a non-utensil. So this hole is big enough to let liquid seep in. Says the Rambam, Hakdeira tmeya v'ha'aliyah tahira. The pot itself becomes impure, but everything in the second floor becomes or stays pure. Now let me explain this for a second. By law, when the pot fills the skylight, the pot becomes part of the roof of the home. It becomes part of the oil. Now we learned multiple times that an oil cannot let impurity through it unless there's a space of a tefach by a tefach. So the fact that there's a small hole for liquid to seep in shouldn't make a difference in this scenario. Furthermore, once a pot gets a hole the size of liquid to seep in, biblically, it's not considered a kli anymore. It's completely pure, and therefore it can completely block impurity from entering it. So really nothing should happen. However, as the commentaries explain, it's one approach in the commentaries, the sages were worried that perhaps there's going to be a scenario where the pottery pot will not fill the entire skylight. And therefore they said that in this case, at least the pot itself we should consider to be impure. Hakdeira Tameya. But it is going to be a blocker insofar as everything else is in the second story. So everything in the second story is going to be pure. However, counterintuitively, Hoysa Shlema, if the pot was complete with no hole, then we're actually going to treat it as a regular pottery utensil acting as a tzamid pasil. We're going to imagine that all of this in the second floor is like it's in the pot, and the pot is tightly covered, and whatever the law would be with a tightly covered pottery pot is going to apply to whatever's in the second story. Kol sheba'aliyah me'oichlinu mashkinu kli cheres tahar. Anything in the second story, food, drink, or pottery utensils will be pure. Aval adam uklei shetef sheba'aliyah tmeim. But a human being or immersible utensils that are in the second story are going to become impure. She'ein kli cheres chaytzetz, because as we said before, a pottery utensil is not enough of a blocker, ela al ha'eichlin ba'ala mashkinu kli cheres, except for food, drink, and pottery utensils. The kol sheba'aliyah tahar, and the status of everything in the second story being pure is as if ki'ilu hu tachas tzamid pasul b'kli cheres. It's as if it's under a tight covering in a pottery utensil. Now everyone should be asking the obvious question. We just said before that if a person is in a pottery utensil, we don't make him impure. So why in this scenario is the person pure? Is the person impure? Says the Rambam, metimu ha'adam sheba'aliyah zu. In this case, they made the person impure in the second story because it is a common scenario. It's not common for a person to be in a jar, but it certainly is common for a person to be walking around the second story. So in this case, where the pottery pot is acting as a pottery jar with a tzamid pasil, anything commonly in this jar would become impure, including a person. Now notice that when the pot had a hole, everything became pure, even the person and the immersible utensils. That's how most commentaries understand it, that there's a difference when there's no hole and when there's a hole. When there's no hole, it's a regular pottery utensil. Once there's a hole, we actually give it the extra leniency of being a non-utensil. Just like any other non-susceptible utensil save everything, so does this one. Although there are some commentaries that say that you have to read it into the Rambam also, that in both scenarios, the Rambam means to say that it acts like a tzamid pasil, the only difference being that if it has a hole, this pottery pot itself becomes impure. That's the only difference. When the Rambam says before, aliyah tahira, he just means to elaborate in a second, that aliyah tahira means only the food, drink, and pottery stuff, not the other things. But the simple meaning is, no, in the first case, everything is saved. In the second case, only pottery and food and drink, but the person and the immersible utensils are impure. The Fikach therefore says that since we're treating this selectively as being in a pottery pot with a tzamid pasil, if on the second story there was a metal utensil and it was full of liquid, take a look at this. Okay, you had a metal bowl full of water. Hakli tame tumas shiva. The bowl itself is not saved, impure for 7 days. V'hamashkin tahirin. But the rabbis didn't impose any decree on the water. The liquid is going to be completely pure. Similarly, if there was a woman kneading a dough in a wooden bowl, the woman and the bowl will become impure. But the dough will be pure as long as she's still handling it. Parsha v'chazra v'nagaba, if she took her hands away and touched it again, tim'atu, she makes it impure by virtue of her touching it. But in the default state, it doesn't become impure. Same thing if you would move the dough or remove the liquid to another utensil, immersible utensil in the second story, they would become impure by contacting the second immersible utensil. But the point is that in the moment of Tumas spreading, it will only spread to the actual immersible utensils, not to anything that they are holding, like the liquid or the dough. This whole law was said if it's a pottery utensil sitting in the way. But if it's any other utensil which saves things in the oyel, like a stone utensil, which has no ability to become susceptible to impurity, they don't even receive impurity as we explained. Therefore, there's no decree of the contact of an amaretz to make it impure. Or it was one of those pottery jars that even amaretzes are careful from. The red heifer one, or the thing used for holy consecrated items, where everyone is believed about their pure status. It will save everything in the second story, unquestionably, whether it has a hole, no tumah can go through it, everything above is pure. Now, before we do the last line, I want to share the sikha that I mentioned before, the talk that the Rebbe has on the generality of this chapter. It emerges that we have three cases when talking about the power of utensils to save in oyel with a tight covering. If it's a utensil which is not susceptible to impurity at all, everything is saved. If it's a pottery utensil, food and drink and pottery get saved, but not immersible utensils. People also get saved in a classic scenario, but if a person is on a second story and there's a pottery blocking, then the person will become impure. So we basically have, I'll just put it on this chart because it's more clear over here. We have non-susceptible utensils are in one category, pottery utensils are in a second category, and the person has two scenarios. Typically he's saved, and in the case of being in the second story, he is not saved. Every single element in halacha has to have a spiritual meaning. What's the spiritual meaning of all these laws? Says the Rebbe, what's life? Life is connection to Hashem. When you stick to God, you're alive. Death means things, entities, don't acknowledge God. So by default, the world, Olam Haza, as we live in it, is a dead place. It represents death. It's not visibly connected to Hashem. For a neshama to come down to this world is like something being in an oyel hameis, being in a room with a corpse. The neshama is the most alive, the most connected to God. And you put it into a dead world, that's like somebody or something coming into an oyel with a dead body. What is the utensil, the keli? That's the body. The neshama comes into the body is the utensil. So just like a utensil in the oyel hameis needs a tight covering to protect what's inside of it, so too the body needs to have a tight covering to protect what's inside of it. So it typically would be Torah and mitzvahs, right? But Torah and mitzvahs only work when you're doing them. What about while you're acting with your body? You're just attending to your physical needs. What about then? What's the guard keeping you from contracting the corpse impurity from the world? So we have typically two approaches. One approach is what's called keli she'eini mekabel tuma. Doesn't receive impurity. That means the person focuses solely on his soul, doing what the soul needs to do, and through the soul influencing the body. But the main thing is called oivdei Hashem benishmasam, serving God with the soul. The body becomes not even part of the equation. So the whole keli doesn't receive any type of impurity. It's completely safe. The other way is to be a kli cheres. Cheres is made out of dirt, afar. Dirt represents bittul, self-nullification. We say every day in davening, "V'nafshi ka'afar lakel tiyeh," my soul should be like dust for everybody. So when you treat, that's a little different than not putting the body in the equation. That's acknowledging the body, but the body is subservient, second level to the soul. Then things that are a part of you, food, drink, oichlin umashkin, they become part of you, get saved. Other things outside of you, clothing, immersible utensils, those don't get saved. Understand? Because you're somewhat acknowledging the body, so some parts of it will get affected by the bodily needs. Additionally, when you're in the realm of pottery, bittul of the body, the person himself, the neshama himself, also gets saved. As the Rambam says, "Mipnei shehu davar she'einei matzoi." Einei matzoi means not common, but einei matzoi also means not present. Since the neshama is not fully present in the world in which it inhabits, so it stays a little distant and stays pure. Counterintuitively, there's a third level. A person who thinks he'll go to a second story. I want to rise to a second story. I don't want to deal with my body at all. Not it's going to be subservient, not it'll be ultimately affected by my soul. I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to go up top, climb the stairs. Says the Rambam, you think you're escaping, you're actually not. When you remove yourself from your body, then you become davar hamatzui. You become vulnerable. And now the tumah can spread to you as well. But if you stay in the body, work with it in one of the ways, either through the soul affecting it or making it subservient to the soul, then you have an element of saving even within the world, which seems to be such a corpse world, until of course we refine it and we bring Mashiach and we bring Hashem into the world, and then it becomes a very pure world. And why is this connected to marriage? Because that's what marriage is also. Chasan, the groom, the word chasan comes from chus darga, descending a level. Because when a person gets married, he descends a level, seemingly. Can't be so pure in yeshiva anymore, can't be so secluded, insulated. Now you got to face the world. What do you do with it? People try to run away. No, not the way. Engage with it, refine it, make it part of the service of Hashem. That's my own addition, but all by divine providence that the Sikha is attached to the Rambam that we learn on Yudalad Kislev. And the final lines in the chapter, Haya oihel natoi ba'aliyah. You have a tent spread in a second story, umiktsasai mirudad al ha'aruba sheben bayis la'aliyah. And part of it, a flap of it, is going over the opening. This is the opening, and there's a flap of a tent covering it. Hareze Matzil, says the Rambam, this covering saves everything in the second story from becoming impure. Even though the roof of the tent is not over the opening. Because the tent saves by virtue of the fact that it's covering, and the flap becomes part of the oil, an extension of it. And the same way the oil protects what it's covering, the flap also protects what it's covering. The tumah cannot penetrate to the second floor. Everything in the second floor is pure.